So I did a thing this year. In our first month, just having moved to the Seattle area last year, my wife Cassandra and I were looking for things to do for the holiday season. And we found this awesome Christmas lights parade in Woodinville. Anyone can be in it as long as they decorate their car with lights, and tons of people come out. Well, I'm an audio engineer and technical director by trade, so I knew enough about programming lights for a stage setting to give me at least a bit of a primer in the crazy Christmas lights world. And I had inherited a pile of LED pixels from an old church set piece that church no longer wanted to deal with supporting. And I thought, I can do that. So fast forward to this year, I decided I was going to. And it was a blast. I programmed 3 songs, and of course, I had to find versions that I liked. But since my car's name is BMO from the cartoon Adventure Time, I wanted to make some windows that have that character's face singing synchronized to the music. And the kiddos loved it. It definitely became a core memory for me just seeing the whole community come out and be so excited to see a bunch of cars driving by. Cassandra and I both commented that our cheeks hurt because we're not used to smiling that much. So now here's the nerd part. How I made it happen. So probably the most important thing that I learned is you need a pure sine wave inverter. This would be wired directly to your battery, just like a subwoofer amplifier might be. So you're going to have to buy the inverter and then probably an amp wiring kit. I wired from the battery through the side of the car, down through the door frames, all the way back behind the seats, and then mounted my inverter in the back of my car. The reason why you need a pure sine wave inverter is most inverters generally have what they call modified sine wave forms. It's more like a jagged waveform. And so when we're working with these electronics, especially with these little Raspberry Pis and stuff like that, you really want to have good power going to it. The other thing is normal inverters that you can buy that you plug into the cigarette outlets, they can really only do like 100 watts of power, and they only have 10 or 25 amp fuses. So my Pixlite controller that I have pulls up to like 320 watts RMS if you have all 16 channels on at full brightness. And then I had speakers involved with that as well, and they're pulling about 100 watts total. In the biggest part of my show, I was pulling 300 watts. But when I first started testing, as soon as I would do a bright white flash, my fuse would blow. And so I got a 500 watt pure sine wave inverter from Amazon. It really wasn't that much. And you can do your own research, but it definitely held up and did everything I needed to do. So the next thing is the lights themselves. I have a bunch of WS2811 LED pixel strings. I believe they're IP65. I got them from Ray Wu probably about 7 years ago. And I know there have been a lot of people who have trouble with the LED pixels going out lately. I've had a few go out over the years, but not a bunch. There were even a few as I was putting them on for the parade the other day that I noticed were out, but it wasn't a big deal in the moment. I had found some magnet clips on Amazon that allow you to magnetize to the metal body of the car. Now, if your car doesn't have a metal body, you're out of luck, but mine does, at least in parts of it. And so I use these magnet clips everywhere I needed to make a turn. I wanted to just anchor them. I didn't want to put it on every single light. Plus, if you can see in this clip, my pixels have this extra little surround that extends a little bit further on the wire. Well, the clips need to clip right there. So I actually, on any one that I had to put a magnet clip on, I had to actually get trimmers out and trim it down. But in order to maintain the seal, since it's going to be out in the rain, I used some flexible plastic glue to both attach it to the clip, but also seal that back up. In hindsight, I probably should have used something more like epoxy that's a little bit thicker and seals a little bit better. For my matrix panels, I'm using a mounting framework called PixNode that you can get from holidaycoro.com. And these were part of the set piece that I had originally had. They were cut in the shape of hexagons. And so I had to cut them apart and kind of gaff tape them together in the shapes that I needed that would fit and fill up my windows. And then the goal was to use suction cups to stick them to my windows. And that failed miserably. We had to essentially put copious amounts of gaffer's tape on the inside of the windows, holding it up to make sure that they didn't fall down. And my wife also had a cane that we had brought for propping it up. She ended up calling it the cane of correction, and she would reach behind her and push it against the window throughout the parade to make sure some of the matrices stayed attached. For next year, I've already looked into some mounting options that I can add to the interior of the car near the windows that actually allow you to mount cargo nets. And I'm going to make some custom paracord attachments to my matrix panels that allow me to just hang it directly from there and pull it taut up against the window spaces. That way we don't have to struggle against it like we did this year. As far as a Pixel controller, along with all of my Pixels, I inherited 3 Pixlite 16 plug-and-play Mark I controllers made by Advatech. And they each have 16 physical outputs. I have mine set to do 170 pixels each, which is 1 DMX universe. I know they can do more. I think they can do 2 universes each, but you have to utilize power injection. And I didn't really want to ever deal with that. And 48 physical universes of pixels is plenty in my book. So I've always had to run my pixel strings at like max 65% brightness, even on solid wall power. When I would go full white in full brightness, it would overload and the pixels would like black out and start flashing, and I would pop a lot of the internal fuses of the Pixlites as well. So after some trials, I kind of got to where 60 to 65% would keep that from happening. And that also kept individual LEDs from going out as well. Now, however, in the car, for whatever reason, the different type of power, I found that I had to put it below 40%. But 40% was more than bright enough for what I needed it to be. To control the actual show, I'm using a Raspberry Pi running Falcon FFP. I'm sending E1.31 or ArtNet over Ethernet cable to the Pixlite. If you're familiar with X-Lights, you know all about FFP and Falcon. I struggled a little bit because the Falcon's default setup is to create a tethering network if it doesn't see a home network. And that's great. That's what I wanted it to do. And whenever I would drive off-site and away from my Wi-Fi, it would boot that up and I was able to connect just fine. But when I was doing testing and I'm kind of at the edge of my home network range, the Raspberry Pi would struggle. It would think it would see it. I could even look it up on my Wi-Fi, see the IP address, but it wasn't fully resolved. And so it would never boot up, would never let me connect it. So I had a little bit of trouble with setting that up. So just be mindful that may give you some frustration. Also, if it sees the Pixel controller first, if it saw my Pixlite first over its Ethernet connector, it wouldn't create the tethering network either. So you have to boot it up in a very specific order. You have to boot the Falcon Pi up first by itself, and then you have to wait for it to broadcast its Wi-Fi tethering network or connect to your home network if you have a strong enough signal, and then you can turn on your Pixel controller. At that point, it will see it on its Ethernet connection and be able to broadcast the show. I tried powering my Raspberry Pi inside my Pixlite. I wanted it to be self-contained because the boxes are nicely sized and it could fit inside it. And I wanted to power my Raspberry Pi internally off of one of the DC power supplies. The power supplies in my Pixlite are 12 volts, and so I needed to get it down to 5 volts. So I bought a 12 volt to 5 volt bucking converter that has a micro USB out, which is the same connection that powers the Raspberry Pi. Now in my house with normal power, it would turn on fine, it would connect, but it never worked consistently in the car. And so I ended up powering it separately using one of my car's USB plugs. That actually ended up working out for the better because it would power on when my car turned on. Then I could let it boot up the Wi-Fi tethering, and then I could switch the inverter on and everything else would turn on. So for programming my light shows, I used X-Lights to program and then upload that to my Falcon Pi. And there's so much stuff online about this. The documentation on X-Lights is fantastic. This is covered all the time. If you're a seasoned Christmas lights professional, you know all about X-Lights and how this works. But I'll talk a little bit about my thought process behind how I set up my show. Because the car is three-dimensional and the lights are surrounding the car as opposed to mostly on one front-facing surface like houses, I did have to think through and map out a grid for the car so that it would all make sense. Also, I wanted the pixel lines to follow the curve of the car, but still make sense with the effects. So like when I would do a sweep down, I wanted it to follow the curve of the car, not a particular vertical line or horizontal line, if that makes any sense. I wanted the whole line, the top line of the car from the windshield all the way over to the back of the car, be one row so that it would act nicely in any motion. I had modeled the entire thing in 3D, I had rotated everything out, the windows at the correct angles and everything, and I wanted to have a good preview of the car during programming. But all that ended up making more work for me because of a few different things. So the effects in X-Lights are not actually 3D. They're 2D mapped onto a 3D space. So perpendicular planes and rotated models in the same model group don't work like you think they will. They'll work on the primary plane, but the ones that are perpendicular will just all be the same data. And then everything rotated really doesn't work either. So I've already reconfigured how I want to visualize my car for next year. I've kind of unwrapped the entire thing onto one plane so that I can use the all group and apply an effect to the entire car, and it all functions just like I want it to. It is a bit harder to fully visualize what I'm doing, but I will probably make some sort of background map with a pic of my car unfolded as well so that it makes more sense. As far as audio is concerned, normally with Christmas lights, you're working with FM transmitters so that people can tune into it on their own vehicle. But for a parade, I needed to actually make the sound audible for people around the car so that it would synchronize up. So I was going to plug directly from my Falcon Pi into the aux line of my car. Well, I did that, and there was a really bad buzz. At first, I thought it was the DC grounding issue between the Pi and how I was powering it. But even once I got the new pure sine wave inverter, it still created that buzz. And then I tested it with another input entirely, and it still created that buzz. So I think that's just the aux line in my car. And so I tried a cheap Bluetooth transmitter, but the delay was almost a second and a half, and I didn't want to have to figure out how to compensate for that in my sequences. So I decided to get out my Yamaha studio monitors and a passive studio monitor controller that I have in my home studio. I ran the output of the audio from the Falcon Pi to the passive studio controller, and then out from that through my sunroof up to the speakers that were on top of the car. The speakers were powered off of the same inverter that I was powering the lights from. The reason why I wanted to use this controller is that the path of the parade had some really narrow neighborhoods and some really open areas. So I wanted easy volume control, and the narrow ones, it felt oppressive to have my speakers up all the way. But then once we would get into these wide open streets, I really wanted to be able to turn it up some. So anyways, that's the basics of how it all works. Let me know in the comments if you want to know any more details of how I did things, or if you have any better ideas for me. I'll actually put some links to some of the specific products that I got so you can see what I was talking about. Thanks a lot for watching. I hope this makes it easy for other people to jump in and do some fun Christmas parade stuff as well. Merry Christmas to all, and to all a good night.